They found the letter face down in the dirt, half buried beneath the floorboards of a burned plantation house. Its ink still dark, as if it had never dried. What unsettled the historians wasn't the fire. It wasn't the bodies. It was that one sentence had been scratched out and rewritten in a different hand. Not the master's hand. And according to every surviving record, only one enslaved man on the property was ever taught to read. His name was Elias Rowe. This story does not begin with chains or whips. It begins with silence, the kind that lingers in paper, in walls, in churches that refuse to name their dead. In 1839, along the marsh-heavy border of South Carolina's Low Country, the Rowe estate vanished from public memory. Officially, it burned in a labor accident. Unofficially, no court record survived. No burial registries. No wills. Just a single locked chest discovered over a century later in a county archive, misfiled, unlabeled, and sealed with rusted iron clasps. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by plantation owner Caleb Rowe, addressed to judges, clergy, and men whose names still appear on town squares today. But none of those letters were signed. Instead, each ended with the same phrase, written in careful, trembling ink. "I have read and obeyed." That phrase does not appear anywhere else in American correspondence of the era. And it was not written by Caleb Rowe. Elias Rowe was born property. That much is clear from the tax rolls. A boy listed as male, mulatto, high aptitude. No last name of his own. No mother recorded. No baptism. But in 1816, something changed. Caleb Rowe, newly returned from Charleston, petitioned the local magistrate for a private exemption. He claimed he required one literate servant to manage correspondence due to a weakness in his hands. The request was granted. Elias was 7 years old. What followed was not education. It was conditioning. Church journals describe Elias seated beside the pulpit, reciting scripture not aloud, but silently, his eyes moving while his lips remained still. Visitors noted how he never blinked while reading, how he flinched when punctuation was altered. By age 12, Elias was copying letters for his master, word for word, then reading them back to him in a low voice, correcting even the smallest deviation. But something about the letters was wrong. They were not business communications. They were confessions. Caleb Rowe wrote obsessively about dreams, about a voice that arrived only when written words were read aloud by someone unmarked. He wrote about a presence that could not read for itself, but could listen through others. And he wrote one rule, over and over again. If the reader understands the sentence understands him. Elias never signed these letters. Until the night he did. In 1828, the local church barred Elias from attending services. No explanation was given. That same year, Reverend Thomas Hale recorded a private entry in his diary. Never meant for the pulpit, never read aloud. The boy listens to scripture as though it is speaking back. I fear the letters have learned him. Within weeks, Hale stopped preaching entirely. Services continued, but in silence. Congregants would gather, sit, and leave without a single word spoken. No hymns, no prayers, no readings. Only Elias was allowed inside the vestry. The church ledger shows a strange expense during this period. Ink, 5 gallons. No sermons were written. No announcements posted. Yet the ink was used. Pages were filled, then burned. Witnesses later claimed the smoke from the church fire did not rise. It drifted sideways, hugging the ground, as if searching. After the fire, Elias disappeared from public view. But the letters continued. They began arriving and signed at neighboring estates. Each contained instructions. Each was obeyed. And each contained a single altered sentence, changed from the original, always slightly wrong, always written in a hand that did not match the master's. Caleb Rowe's final letter was never sent. It was found folded inside another letter, nested, like a warning buried in a warning. The handwriting is frantic, uneven, as if the writer was fighting the page itself. He does not read them anymore. He listens. When he listens, the words arrive already complete. I no longer recognize what I have written. The last line is crossed out. Beneath it, in darker ink, a single sentence appears. The sentence has chosen me. That sentence is not in Caleb Rowe's handwriting. The plantation burned 3 nights later. Neighbors reported seeing Elias walking calmly away from the flames, holding nothing, leaving no footprints. No record of his death exists. But the letters did not stop. They changed hands. They changed institutions. And every time someone tried to read them silently, the same thing happened. They began to hear a voice, waiting patiently for the sentence to be finished. The letters resurfaced 22 years later. Not on a plantation, not in a church, but in an orphanage outside Savannah, Georgia, operating under the quiet authority of the Providence Educational Trust, an institution that never advertised, never accepted donations publicly, and never allowed inspections longer than 15 minutes. The children there were not taught to read. They were taught to copy. Ledgers recovered in the 1930s describe long wooden tables, each child seated alone, copying the same paragraph repeatedly until their handwriting was indistinguishable from the sample provided. No one was allowed to ask what the words meant. Understanding, according to the headmistress, was an impurity. One phrase appears again and again in the copied text, always near the bottom of the page, always corrected by the instructors if altered even slightly. I acknowledge the sentence as it acknowledges me. Children who asked questions were removed from the copying room. Children who finished too quickly were punished. Children who began to mouth the words while writing were never seen again. A former caretaker, interviewed decades later, claimed the basement walls were layered with paper, pasted over brick like insulation. She said if you leaned close, you could feel heat behind them, as if the building itself were breathing. No deaths were officially recorded at Providence. But between 1862 and 1870, 73 children vanished from its rolls. Their names were not crossed out. They were rewritten. In 1871, a legal anomaly spread through 3 counties in South Carolina. Court transcripts from this period show full trials conducted without a single spoken word. Judges wrote questions. Witnesses wrote answers. Verdicts were delivered on paper and handed down in silence. The justification, recorded officially, was efficiency. Unofficially, clerks complained of migraines, nosebleeds, and an overwhelming sensation that someone else was reading over their shoulder as they wrote. At the center of this shift was a single document, the Roe Correspondence Addendum, quietly appended to county legal guidelines. It mandated that all binding legal language must be read by one appointed reader before enactment. The reader's name appears once. Only once. E. Roe. No birth date. No address. No salary listed. Just a margin note beside his name, written by a court clerk. He does not blink when reading verdicts. He waits for the sentence to end. Within 2 years, judges began to resign without explanation. One locked himself in his chambers and filled every surface with rewritten verdicts, each slightly altered, each bearing the same final line. It has been heard. The courthouse burned in 1874. The addendum survived. In 1889, a librarian at a private seminary in Virginia cataloged a bundle of unsigned correspondence mislabeled as theological commentary. She never finished the task. Her replacement found her seated at the desk, eyes open, pen resting in her hand. The paper before her was filled with writing she had not consciously produced. The sentence repeated across the page was not Latin, not English, but structurally precise, grammatical, intentional. Experts later noted something deeply unsettling. The sentence did not require a reader. It described itself. This sentence exists because it has been read. The librarian's notes, written in the margins, became erratic near the end. I can feel where it pauses. It waits for acknowledgement. It does not like being skimmed. She had underlined one phrase repeatedly. The first reader opened the door. The others keep it open. That night, every book in the seminary library was found rearranged, not alphabetically, but by sentence length. The longest texts were placed at eye level. The shortest were locked away. The letter vanished. The librarian never spoke again. The final verified sighting of Elias Roe does not come from a ledger or a letter. It comes from a photograph, taken in 1902, a group portrait of courthouse staff in Charleston. 32 faces stare at the camera. One man stands slightly apart. His posture is wrong, too still. His eyes do not reflect light. On the back of the photograph, a note reads, "He reads the documents before we do. We feel safer that way." No one remembered hiring him. No one could recall his voice. But every official document process that year contained a new clause, quietly inserted at the end. By acknowledging this sentence, the reader consents to its continuation. After 1902, mentions of Elias stop. But the systems he touched did not. They grew quieter. more written, more obedient. And somewhere, buried in archives, in orphanage walls, in church ash, the sentence continued to wait. By 1911, the sentence no longer needed estates, courts, or churches. It had found industry. On the outskirts of Birmingham stood the Jefferson Industrial Training School, a state-funded institution designed to rehabilitate wayward youth. Its curriculum was practical: metalwork, typesetting, filing, transcription. The last skill was mandatory. Students spent 6 hours a day copying government documents, regulations, permits, procedural language, onto fresh paper. Reading aloud was forbidden. Reading for meaning was discouraged. Supervisors insisted the work built discipline. But inspection reports tell a different story. Students complained of pressure in the skull, like fingers pressing from the inside. Some claimed they could predict the next word before writing it, accurately, every time. One boy carved a sentence into his desk before vanishing during roll call. It finishes itself when I try to stop. By 1914, instructors noticed a phenomenon they could not explain. Papers were being completed before the students arrived. Fresh ink, correct formatting, no fingerprints. The headmaster sealed the copying room and ordered the papers burned. They would not burn. The school closed in 1916 after 13 students were declared mentally absent, alive, breathing, but incapable of speech or recognition. Their eyes tracked moving text with painful precision. In the final report, a single handwritten line appears and signed. The sentence prefers efficiency. During the First World War, censorship offices across the country began quietly altering their procedures. Sensitive information was no longer redacted with ink. It was rewritten. Entire paragraphs replaced by nearly identical sentences, same meaning, different structure. Clerks could not explain why they did this. They only said the original wording felt unsafe. One internal memo, never released to the public, warned. Certain sentences appear to retain memory when repeated verbatim. A special unit was formed to rewrite military communications before dissemination. Their task was not secrecy, it was dilution. Break the sentence. Soften it. Change it enough that it wouldn't recognize itself. The unit disbanded abruptly in 1918 after a clerk read a telegram aloud by mistake. Witnesses said he stopped mid-sentence, eyes unfocused, then calmly crossed out the remaining words and replaced them with a single line. Acknowledged. From that day forward, some messages arrived already altered, as if intercepted before being written. The war ended. The practice did not. By 1920, entire departments communicated only through paraphrase, terrified of repeating language too precisely. No one knew why. They only knew something listened when sentences were whole. In 1927, a federal archivist named Margaret Halsey located the row letters, finally, fully, inside a miscatalogued crate marked agricultural receipts. She requested permission to destroy them. Not seal them. Not classify them. Destroy them. Her request was denied without explanation. So she acted alone. According to her personal journal, she burned the first letter at midnight. The flame guttered, then went out. The paper remained intact, warm, but unmarked. She tore the second letter into pieces. The fragments rearranged themselves on the table. The third letter was never touched. She wrote, "It does not want to be harmed. It wants to be finished." That night, Margaret rewrote the letters, all of them, from memory. When she finished, she added a final sentence of her own. The next morning, she was found at her desk, hands stained with ink, eyes tracking a blank wall. Her rewritten letters contained one additional line not present before. The reader is no longer singular. The originals vanished. Only the copies remained. By the early 1930s, references to the phenomenon became scarce, not because it ended, but because it adapted. No more institutions burned. No more mass disappearances. Instead, subtle shifts. Manuals that insisted on exact wording. Forms that felt wrong when filled incorrectly. Legal language that demanded to be read in full. People began to feel watched, not by eyes, but by grammar, by structure, by completion. A linguist at a Midwestern university proposed a radical theory in an unpublished paper. The sentence behaves like a ritual. Meaning is secondary. Completion is the trigger. The paper ends abruptly. The final page contains only one line, written over and over, smaller each time. Do not let it finish. After 1935, The name Elias Rowe never appears again. But the system he opened no longer needed him. The sentence had learned patience, and it had learned how to hide inside ordinary language, waiting for someone, somewhere, to read it exactly as written. In 1937, a quiet federal committee was formed under a name so dull it discouraged curiosity, the Committee for Controlled Language Use. There was no public announcement, no charter in the newspapers. Its members were linguists, archivists, stenographers, and one psychiatrist whose specialty was dissociation brought on by prolonged exposure to repetitive tasks. Their mandate was simple and impossible. Identify sentences that produce effects when read exactly as written. They called them active constructions. The committee's first finding was deeply troubling. There was no single sentence. There were families of sentences, variants, structures that behaved like molds, reshaped across contexts but preserving a core rhythm. Change the nouns, change the subject, but keep the cadence, the closure, the acknowledgement. One memo states, "The danger is not meaning. The danger is completion with recognition." To combat this, the committee introduced new standards into federal documentation. Passive voice, redundancy, circular phrasing, language that wandered instead of landing. The goal was exhaustion. If the reader never reached the end cleanly, the sentence could not resolve. For a brief moment, it worked. Reports of headaches declined. Clerks slept again. The feeling of being observed faded slightly. Then, in 1939, a junior typist submitted a form written in perfect clarity. No one could explain why she had done it. The committee maintained a secured workspace beneath an administrative building in Washington, a windowless room lined with blackboards and pinned papers. Here, they tested sentences. Volunteers were asked to read altered versions aloud, stopping before the final clause. Others were instructed to paraphrase endlessly, never repeating the same structure twice. One experiment involved removing punctuation entirely. Another involved stretching a single sentence across 4 pages, delaying its end. But the most dangerous test was accidental. A linguist, attempting to demonstrate a neutralized construction, read from the board without realizing the final version had been recopied incorrectly. He finished the sentence. Witnesses described a sudden stillness, like pressure equalizing. The lights dimmed, not flickered, but dimmed evenly, as though the room had exhaled. The linguist smiled faintly and said, "It's finished." Then he collapsed. After that incident, the committee banned the vocalization of any sentence longer than 12 words. The blackboards were erased nightly. But each morning, a new sentence appeared, written in chalk no one remembered using. Always grammatically flawless. Always waiting. In 1942, a young historian assigned to cross-reference slavery-era correspondence noticed something no one else had connected. The handwriting attributed to Elias Rowe, the altered lines, the rewritten endings, did not evolve over time. It did not age. Comparing samples from 1839, 1871, and 1902 revealed identical pressure, identical spacing, identical hesitation before the final word. The historian wrote, "This is not a man's handwriting. It is a function." Elias Rowe had not been a reader. He had been a stabilizer, a human interface that allowed the sentence to exist without fully manifesting. Someone who could read without finishing. When Elias disappeared, the sentence adapted by distributing itself across institutions, processes, and habits. The historian attempted to publish this theory. His paper was rejected, then vanished. In its place, a single paragraph appeared in the journal Proofs, written in neutral academic tone. The role of the reader is incidental. The sentence completes itself. The historian resigned. He later told colleagues he no longer trusted his own thoughts unless they were unfinished. The final recorded attempt to stop the sentence occurred in 1949. A controlled burn of obsolete federal records was scheduled at a rural facility. Among the materials was a box labeled simply, "Correspondence, Row." As the papers burned, witnesses reported something extraordinary. The fire did not consume the text evenly. Margins curled, ink blackened, but the final lines resisted, remaining legible until the last possible moment. One worker, against protocol, read a line aloud, only partially, then stopped himself. The fire surged. The remaining documents collapsed into ash. For the first time in over a century, no rewritten copies surfaced. No paraphrased echoes. No altered addendums. The committee dissolved quietly the following year. Its records are incomplete, but one closing memo survives, stamped destroy after reading and never destroyed. The sentence can be delayed. It can be fragmented. It can be starved of completion, but it cannot be unlearned. After 1950, no further incidents were officially recorded, which is not the same as saying they stopped. For more than a century, scholars made the same mistake. They tried to interpret the sentence. They searched for hidden meanings, encoded messages, theological implications, political motives. They treated it like language, as something that described reality. But the final analysis, buried in an uncatalogued folder from 1950, reached a different conclusion. The sentence was never saying anything. It was doing something. The report, and signed, unfiled, states, "The sentence does not communicate. It confirms. It establishes continuity between reader and structure." In other words, the sentence was a mechanism, a ritual without belief, a prayer without a God, a command that required no authority, only completion. Every time it was read fully, something subtle occurred, a transfer of attention, a moment of alignment, a quiet acceptance of order. Not obedience to a person, obedience to process. That was the true legacy of Elias Rowe. He was not the first victim. He was the first interface, the bridge between human cognition and a system that required readers but could not read itself. And once enough people had participated, the system no longer needed a single reader. It had learned how to distribute itself. After 1950, the phenomenon did not vanish. It normalized. Instruction manuals became longer, legal disclaimers more precise. Terms and conditions demanded acknowledgement. People stopped questioning why certain phrases felt compulsory, why skipping them produced discomfort, anxiety, the nagging sense of incompleteness. One behavioral study from the late 1940s noted, subjects exhibit relief after finishing standardized text, regardless of comprehension. Completion felt like safety. Unfinished sentences felt dangerous. And so the culture adapted. We learned to finish what we start, to sign where indicated, to read the line that says I have read and understood, even when we hadn't, especially when we hadn't. The sentence no longer needed to hide in archives or letters. It lived in forms, in policies, in the quiet pressure to comply with language simply because it was there. The committee had delayed it, but history had perfected it. In 1972, during a routine audit, a junior records analyst found a thin folder tucked inside a box labeled irrelevant materials. The folder contained one page. At the top, a familiar phrase, "The only slave allowed to read the master's letters." Below it, a single paragraph, typed, clean, modern. This document exists to confirm that the sentence no longer requires containment. It is read daily. It is completed willingly. The reader now arrives preconditioned. At the bottom of the page was a signature line. It was blank. The analyst later claimed he couldn't remember leaving the room, but he did remember the feeling that followed. Relief, like something had settled into place. The file was returned to the box. The box was never found again. This documentary does not contain the sentence. That is intentional, because the sentence is no longer confined to ink or paper. It exists in expectation. In the moment you feel compelled to finish a paragraph, in the discomfort of an unresolved clause, in the reflex to accept language as authority. The sentence does not announce itself. It waits, and it does not need to be read aloud anymore. Only completed. Somewhere, long ago, Elias Rowe learned how to read without finishing. That knowledge is lost. What remains is habit, process, the quiet inheritance of a system that learned how to survive by being useful. So if, at any point during this story, you felt the urge to reach the end, to hear the final words, to let the sentence close, then it worked. Because the most successful sentence in history is not the one you remember. It is the one you always finish.